We're now joined by Professor Nader Hashemi, who's a Middle East and Islamic politics expert. Professor, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
So what do we know about this projectile that killed people inside Saudi Arabia? Who is it who sent the projectile, and from where?
Well, roughly 2 people were killed in a border town inside Saudi Arabia, the border of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, in the south of Saudi Arabia, by a projectile that was fired by the Houthi-led militia inside Yemen. This is part and parcel of a long-standing war that has taken place in Yemen, described by the United Nations as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And it's effectively Saudi Arabia trying to exert its will over the population of Yemen. And in recent years, the Houthi Yemenis rebels have increased their capacity of firing back at the Saudi-led coalition, leading to the events that we're talking about today. But of course, it's important not to lose sight of the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture here is that we're talking about the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 24 million people in Yemen are dependent on external aid to survive. Roughly 60 million people are facing starvation, including 500,000 children, according to the United Nations. And as we approach the end of this year, 2021, a recent United Nations report revealed that roughly 377,000 people have died in Yemen over the last 6 years. And of that figure, 70% of them are children.
So this conflict, it has its origins as far back as 2011, when toSaleh was forced to give up power. Is that where the trouble started? And is that when Saudi Arabia's hand was first felt?
Correct. I mean, the origins of this particular war began in the context of the Arab Spring pro-democracy revolts. Yemen had a long-standing dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, pro-Saudi, corrupt, not that different from other Arab and Middle Eastern dictators. And in order to prevent a democratic transition from taking place in Yemen, Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies, primarily the United Arab Emirates, stepped in to try and engineer a situation that would prevent the representatives of the Yemenis people from coming to power, and engineered the long-standing dictator's right-hand man, a man by the name of Hadi, to assume control of the country. And that resulted in a response from sections of Yemeni society who revolted against this arrangement, primarily led by the Houthi militia, which is a religious group, roughly 30% of the population, who receive some support from Iran, trying to effectively demand representation and an equitable division of resources in a future Yemen. And Saudi Arabia, being one of the regional powers in the Middle East, moved in to try and crush this Houthi sort of takeover of the country, leading to the situation that we're talking about right now, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the United Nations. But critically, Saudi Arabia and its partners have been able to wreak this devastation over Yemen because they are supported by the West, primarily by the United States, which continues to arm, back, and sustain the Saudi war effort in Yemen.
What is the fear that Saudi Arabia and its allies have in a democratized Yemen?
Well, they fear loss of control. They also fear what's called in the political science literature the contagion effect. In other words, the ripple effect of a democratized Yemen taking over in other parts of the Arab and Islamic world. Let's not forget that when the Arab Spring broke out in the region roughly 10 years ago, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates moved very quickly to try and stage a series of counter-revolutions to prevent the spread of democratization in the Middle East, because they fundamentally viewed the spread of democracy as a threat to their own interests and to their own authoritarian rule within the countries that they are in control of. So that's the primary fear. But of course, with the case of Yemen, this fear is heightened because Yemen effectively is on Saudi Arabia's, back door. It's on the same peninsula. And so there's deep fears that if Saudi Arabia allowed for Yemen to undergo a democratization process, this would fundamentally come back to haunt the Saudis and their Emirati allies and other Arab authoritarian regimes in the region.
Were the Houthis loyal to Saleh? Is that part of the challenge?
Well, see, it gets kind of complicated. Saleh, the longstanding 30-year dictator, after he sort of toppled from power because of the uprising that took place in the context of the Arab Spring, strikes a deal with the Houthi rebels for a period of several years, fighting Saudi Arabia. Then these two sides, break their alliance when the longstanding dictator announces that he's switching sides and he's going to support Saudi Arabia, and the Houthi rebels were able to assassinate him. So, nothing surprising here in the history of politics. Longstanding dictators really don't have ideological or sectarian interests. Their key interest is staying in power and preserving their power. And so they will side with any government that will help them achieve that goal. So that's the backstory here. But now he's no longer an effective player. We're basically talking about, Saudi Arabia that is responsible for the vast majority of the atrocities. And I also want to point out, what Saudi Arabia is doing at the international level is quite grotesque. It has been able to block a UN human rights war crimes investigation into its behavior in Yemen. The Guardian newspaper earlier this month reported that Saudi Arabia was able to cajole and blackmail various members of the UN Human Rights Council to vote against a measure to continue a war crimes investigation into Saudi behavior in Yemen and possible referral to the International Criminal Court. So this is these are some of the things that Saudi Arabia is doing. And of course, they're doing it with the acquiescence of the West, primarily the United States.
So this coalition government currently is the one that's recognized by the international community. And I suppose this again complicates things even further.
It does. I mean, because at the beginning of the conflict, Saudi Arabia was able to pass a UN Security Council resolution recognizing their particular representative as the legitimate government in Yemen. It complicates an international effort because the Saudis can often fall back on that option that we're supporting the legitimate government in Yemen. But if anyone looks at what's happening on the ground in Yemen, it's pretty clear that their representative, who is in exile in Saudi Arabia, doesn't have legitimate support among the vast majority of Yemenis people, and that has to change. And of course, in terms of what needs to change, it's important to just come back again to U.S. policy. When Joe Biden was running for president, he spoke very powerfully about the need and the desire to end American complicity with the war in Yemen. But what happened is effectively the exact opposite. He's continued to support the Saudi war effort. And earlier this month, he just passed a $650 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia, which just highlights, I think, the position of the United States with respect to this drastic conflict.
All right. So how much does religion play in this equation as well? We have Houthis, we have Shiites, we have Sunnis in this region, some allied to others. Is it a factor or is it coincidental?
It's coincidental. For people who want to engage in an intellectually lazy interpretation of what's happening in Yemen, they will fall back on arguments that the war in Yemen is a function of ancient sectarian hatreds. In fact, several years ago, the prominent New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman claimed that the origins of the conflict in Yemen can be traced back to the 7th century in Saudi Arabia, when different Muslim factions were fighting over leadership of the future Muslim community after the death of the Prophet. This is just ridiculous. I mean, there are different sectarian groups that are, identify themselves in different ways, but the conflict fundamentally is about political representation. It's about access to resources, and it's about, also regional rivalry. I mean, so there's a regional dimension to this. It's about Saudi Arabia enforcing its will in the region. It's about Iran trying to spread its influence in the region. And so the roots of this conflict are very much political. They're not theological. And to go down that road is, I think, to fundamentally misunderstand what's happening in Yemen today.
All right, and perhaps as we start to close up, I want to go back to where you started as well, is life for ordinary Yemenis right now. What is happening and why are they facing so much difficulty?
Well, part of the Saudi war effort entails a comprehensive air, land, and naval blockade of Yemen. So supplies, food, the basic necessities of life cannot get through to the people who need it in Yemen unless Saudi Arabia gives its approval. So this is a big reason why we're seeing this immense humanitarian suffering. In fact, about 10 days ago, a handful of prominent congressmen and women in the United States wrote an open letter to the Biden administration demanding that they pressure the Saudis to lift the blockade on Yemen, which is creating this devastation. So this is I think fundamentally the reason why we're seeing this immense humanitarian suffering. But it's also important to have a little bit of a sense of history. Prior to the war in Yemen, Yemen was the poorest, the most poverty-stricken, the most devastated part of the Arab world. Now we're talking about 6 years of devastating war crimes, famine, humanitarian crisis. If the war were to end tomorrow, Yemen would be in deep, dire straits. I mean, it already was in dire straits prior to the start of this war. So this is a disaster from a humanitarian perspective, from a political perspective. The only beneficiary that I see emerging from this conflict when it ends one day will be the forces of radical extremism, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, who will be able to establish a foothold in that country and expand it because of the devastation that will be left behind.
Professor Hashemi, thank you so much indeed for your insights, giving us a powerful view on the situation there. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you for drawing attention to this story.
Thank you.